So let's think about the basic functions of the lymphatic system now. Well, obviously there's drainage of the excess tissue fluid, and remember, once it goes from the tissue spaces into the lymphatic vessel, it becomes lymph, and that's drained away through the lymph nodes, eventually back into the subclavian veins. And of course, the lymphatic system, the lymphoid tissue in the lymphatic system, contains lymphocytes and macrophages. The lymphocytes, when they're challenged by an antigen, will start producing specific antibodies to combat that antigen. So there's this immunological protective function. And of course the macrophages can phagocytose viruses and bacteria straight away. Movement of the lymphatic fluid throughout the body is facilitated by the contraction of the lymphatic vessels, pulsation of adjacent arteries, contraction of skeletal muscles, and also negative pressures set up during ventilation. So the lymphatic fluid is moved through the body to get back into the subclavian veins. The lymphoid tissue, the lymphatic tissue, filters and phagocytoses, so the lymphatic fluid is filtered, and phagocytosis and the immunological response can take place. The lymphatic system, of course, is storing many millions of lymphocytes. They're there in reserve should there be an antigenic challenge. And of course the lacteals in the villi of the small intestine are absorbing fats, absorbing the chylomicrons and producing the milky lymphatic fluid called chyle. So tissue fluid is formed as the blood and plasma go through a capillary. Tissue fluid is formed at the arterial end of a capillary because the hydrostatic pressure is greater than the osmotic pressure. So there's more pressure pushing out than there is sucking in, so tissue fluid is formed. At the venous end of the capillary, the hydrostatic pressure, that is the blood pressure in the capillary, has dropped. The osmotic pressure remains the same. So now at the venous end of the capillary, the osmotic pressure is greater than the hydrostatic pressure, so tissue fluid is sucked back in. And about 90% of the tissue fluid which is formed at the arterial end of the capillary is reabsorbed at the venous end of the capillary. The other 10% is drained away via the lymphatic vessels. And given that there's about 3 litres of fluid a day form as lymph, about 3 litres of lymphatic fluid a day goes back into the venous system. That means that there's about 30 litres of tissue fluid formed per day, but 90% of that is simply reabsorbed at the venous end of the capillary. Now the network of lymphatic capillaries is going to be essentially as extensive as the network of blood capillaries. There's going to be untold millions of lymphatic capillaries, and they're blind-ended because the tissue fluid is absorbed into them and becomes lymph as it does so. And the walls overlap and are flappy, so the material can get in to the lumen of the lymphatic vessel. And once it's in, they flap back to form a valve to prevent fluid going from the lymphatic capillaries back into the tissue spaces. The lymphatic capillaries are wider than blood capillaries, and this is good because it means that cell debris or bacteria can easily get into the lymphatic capillary and then be drained away. But they have a limited basement membrane, unlike the blood capillaries. So the blood capillaries have a full basement membrane, and the endothelial cells rest underneath that. But because the lymphatic cells need to be flappy to allow large things in like proteins and bacteria, there's a very limited basement membrane to allow mobility of the cells. And you might remember that the endothelial cells of the lymphatic capillaries also have anchoring filaments, these radial anchoring filaments, so that if the pressure of the tissue fluid increases in the interstitial space, that won't squash the lymphatic capillary, but it will help it to dilate, thereby increasing the amount of lymphatic fluid which can be drained over a particular period of time. So thinking about now the structures of the lymphatic drainage system, the tissue fluid drains into the capillaries and becomes lymphatic fluid, and this flows on into afferent lymphatic vessels. These have valves to ensure one-way flow from the capillaries through the afferent vessels into the lymph nodes. And you can remember A for access. The afferent vessels are taking lymphatic fluid to the lymph nodes. Then once the fluid has been through the lymph nodes, it drains in the efferent lymphatic vessels, which are going to be larger. And you can remember E for exit, or E for effluent, that comes out, but it's not effluent, it's exits. E for exit is probably the best thing. Efferent lymphatic vessels taking the lymphatic fluid on into progressively larger, and then the large lymphatic vessels are called the lymphatic trunks. And in the small intestine, the lacteals drain the chyle. Now the right lymphatic duct is just draining the right side of the head, the right side of the neck, the right arm and part of the right chest. And this duct is only fairly short before it goes into the right subclavian vein. But the left thoracic duct is quite long, because you might remember this begins at the, here I've got cisterna chyli. It's an alternative name, we also called it the chyle cistern. The chyle cistern. It's the same thing. Cistern, I guess, is a fluid containing reservoir, and chyle is the fluid that contains the chylomicrons. So the left thoracic duct begins at this dilated cisterna chyli. You might remember the main lymphatic trunks from the abdomen drain into the cisterna chyli. The left thoracic duct goes through the diaphragm and all the way up. It's about 40 centimetres long, all the way up to the left subclavian vein. And it's also about half a centimetre wide. So they're the main structures in the lymphatic drainage system. So obviously, lymphatic fluid needs to move from the capillaries, where it leaves the interstitial spaces and goes into the capillaries, and get all the way back to the subclavian veins via the large left and right lymphatic ducts. Well, we now know that the endothelial cells in the lymphatic capillaries themselves are contractile. And then in the larger vessels, there are contractile filaments in the walls that contract and relax rhythmically. And also there's valves, which ensures one-way flow of lymphatic fluid from the capillaries towards the large lymphatic ducts. As the lymphatic goes through a skeletal muscle, the skeletal muscle will contract and relax. That will alternatively squeeze and take the pressure off the lymphatic vessel, contributing towards lymphatic return in exactly the same way as veins going through muscles aid venous return. As the muscle contracts, the vein is compressed in the same way. There's also contraction of adjacent arteries, which will put pressure on the lymphatic vessels, increasing the pressure in them, aiding the return of the lymphatic fluid. And there's also something called the respiratory pump. So when you breathe in, the diaphragm's going to go down, the ribs and intercostal muscles are going to go up and out. And that will increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. If you increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, you decrease the pressure. And as well as sucking air in, that will also aid venous return and also aid lymphatic return. So deep breathing exercises are going to increase lymphatic return, as well as getting more air into the lungs and as well as increasing venous return. That's why if someone has a problem with lymphatics, that exercise is so important. It will increase arterial pulsations, it will contract skeletal muscles, it will increase respiratory depth and rate, And all of those things will help the lymphatic fluid to return up into the central veins. And it's interesting to note that the lymphatic system, the lymphatic drainage system, has a significant redundancy built into it. And it's been estimated that it can cope from 10 to 50 times. It can cope with 10 to 50 times more lymphatic fluid than normal when it's called upon to carry more fluid than would normally be the case. So it can transport many, many more times the volume of lymphatic fluid than it needs to normally if there's an exceptional circumstance where it needs to transport more. The lymph nodes have a fibrous tissue capsule, so they can be considered as little organs really because they're in their own capsule, and there's several hundred of them in the body. And they vary from very, very small, about 0.1 of a centimetre, to about 2.5 centimetres in size. And inside they have a reticular network that acts as a three-dimensional scaffolding where the lymphocytes and the macrophages live. It's the habitat for them. So lymphoid tissue really is a combination of the reticulum and the lymphocytes and the macrophages. That's what lymphoid tissue or lymphatic tissue actually is. The lymph nodes filter the lymphatic fluid that's percolating through them. They therefore have a defence mechanism. Any infection that percolates through them can be attacked and immunologically combated in the lymph node. And the lymph nodes are the main site of antigen presentation. Now, an antigen is anything the body recognises as being foreign. It could be a virus, it could be a bacteria. An antigen is actually short for antibody generating molecule, antibody generators. So the antigen, which is foreign, causes the lymphocytes to produce antibodies, and the antibodies are the immune proteins that have this great immunological function. And also in the lymph nodes there's lymphocyte proliferation. So the antigen will trigger a particular type of lymphocyte to divide, to produce many more copies of itself so that large volumes of the antibody can be produced to combat the antigen fairly quickly. And very often fluid actually percolates through several lymph nodes, not just one, a series of lymph nodes, before it gets back into the blood in the subclavian veins. So let's think about the sites where there's clusters of lymph nodes. The lymph nodes don't occur arbitrarily throughout the body, they are clustered in particular areas. So the pericranial, first of all, around about the base of the head. The cervical are along the internal jugular vein in the neck. The axillary are in the armpits. The tracheal associated nodes drain a lot of the lymphatic fluid that is coming back from the lungs. The deep abdominal lymph nodes are often close to the aorta. The inguinal lymph nodes in the groin run along the line of the inguinal ligament. And the femoral lymph nodes run along the line of the femoral vein at the top of the legs. Once the interstitial fluid goes into the lymphatic capillaries, we call it lymph. And this is going to be clear and colourless because it derives from the plasma and it derives from the tissue fluid. And about 3 litres a day of lymphatic fluid will drain back into the venous system. And it's going to contain water and electrolytes, but sometimes, especially if there's been tissue damage, it might contain cell debris. If it's coming from the small intestine, it's going to be described as chyle. It's going to be milky because it's from the lacteals containing the chylomicrons. Crucially, lymphatic fluid drains away proteins from the interstitial spaces. This is vital because if the proteins were retained in the tissue spaces, that would increase the osmotic suction into the tissue spaces and edema would develop. So it's vital that the lymphatic system drains away any proteins which escape from the capillaries in the tissues. If there's infection, the lymphatic vessels will transport away bacteria and viruses in the lymphatic fluid. And should there be a malignancy, the cancer cells very often lose their adhesion from each other and they can fall away, and they'll be drained in the lymphatic fluid and can often collect in the lymph nodes in the unfortunate circumstance of malignant disease. So let's think about the order of the flow of lymphatic fluid around the body. We know it derives from the plasma, and some of the components of plasma, the water and some proteins, get into the tissue fluid in the interstitial spaces. If it's not reabsorbed into the venous end of the capillary, it goes into the lymphatic capillaries. These drain into the afferent lymphatic vessels. These drain into the lymph nodes. The efferent lymphatic vessels drain the lymph nodes. And these go into progressively larger lymphatic trunks. Ultimately, there's the right and left lymphatic ducts. And it's the ducts that drain the lymphatic fluid back into the junction between the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein. And of course that completes the cycle all the way back into the plasma in the blood. A complete circulation of lymphatic fluid from the plasma to the plasma. I'm just going to mention two disorders briefly. The first one is lymphadenopathy. Now, the lymph part makes sense, and adeno means to do with glands, and pathy means disease of. So lymphadenopathy means disease of the lymph glands. But of course we know that they're lymph nodes, not lymph glands. So I guess this must be an old-fashioned term when people thought the lymph nodes were glands. They're not. A gland is a structure which produces something. And the lymph nodes don't really have a secretory product, so they're not glands. But that's where that term comes from. Adeno means gland. Literally that means lymph gland disease, lymphadenopathy. So really, lymphadenopathy, it's still a term we use, but it means swollen lymph nodes. And if there's infection in part of the body, that can drain into the lymph nodes, and the bacteria and the antibodies can sort of fight it out in the lymph node. But because there's infection, viruses or bacteria in the lymph nodes, that will cause some swelling, which will make them swell. And also there can be multiplication of bacteria, which can increase the bulk. And also there's multiplication of the lymphatic cells and macrophages, again, which makes the gland bulky. So if you've got a sore throat, very often it's common to have swollen glands underneath the mandible, for example. Or if you've got infection in the arm, you can have axillary lymph nodes. Infection in the leg, then the groin lymph nodes can be swollen. There can be a regional lymphadenopathy. If the infection's internal, of course, you can't feel the swollen glands, but they will be swollen in the same way, just that you can't palpate them externally. Lymphangitis is inflammation of the lymphatic vessels. So if there's an infection, you might see a red, angry line going away from the site of infection. This is because the bacteria are being drained away in a lymphatic vessel. The bacteria are producing toxins. This is stimulating an inflammatory response, and you can see this line of inflammation as the lymph node drains the bacteria away from the site. And this is sometimes called tracking. So lymphadenopathy and lymphangitis.